Hello and welcome to this very special PC Games Hardware retro episode. On August 24th, 1994, 3dfx was founded. To celebrate this special day, we have interviewed two of the three founders of 3dfx, Scott Sellers and Ross Smith. We have asked them about the early days of 3dfx, the thoughts behind the foundation, the competition with Nvidia, the failures, Rampage, Spectre, and of course, the Voodoo 6000. But enough from me, I hand over the word to Scott and Ross.
If you're ready, I will just dive right into the first question.
Sure.
It's a more general one. Could you explain in a few words how you went from leaving SGI and MediaVision, of course, to establishing and founding 3dfx Interactive? Who had the idea and why?
Well, it all dates back to SGI, as you know. Gary, actually the three of us, Gary, Ross, and I, did not know each other at SGI. I think maybe Ross and Gary did a little bit, but SGI at that point was a pretty big company. Ross actually came out of the division of SGI that was their microprocessor division called MIPS Technologies, and MIPS processors and all that. Where we really got to know each other was at a startup called Pellucid.
Yeah.
And Pellucid was formed in, I think it was 1992. And it was a couple of executives from SGI that, had this idea that we could bring some of the SGI know-how and expertise in graphics and, let's bring that to really the initial idea was kind of professional workstations. And SGI had created, basically there were plug-in PC boards called the Iris Vision.
Yeah.
And, at the time, if you remember back in the early days of PCs, these were ISA boards. So like the slowest interface ever. And, you'd plug in an Iris Vision board into a PC and communicate over the ISA interface. And these things were so expensive. I think the Iris Vision was more expensive than a PC at that point. So the whole equation was bizarre. And SGI had developed these things. But, one of the things that was always frustrating for me, and I think for Gary to some degree, when we were at SGI, was SGI kept talking about creating products and technologies that, were much lower cost, but they never really could do it. It was a fantastic place to work because they hired, the best engineers and they allowed the best engineers to do their thing. But there was never really the underlying, hard decisions that were, frankly, in my opinion, ever made at SGI to say, look, you could develop this great technology, but it's got to have some sort of bound in terms of what's your price point, what's the minimum viable product, all those kind of product management things that ultimately the best products, adhere to. And so despite many attempts, SGI never was very successful in terms of creating more of a personal 3D graphics product. That was what the Iris Vision was intended to do. And so one of the founders of Pellucid specifically had worked on this product. His name is Bharat Sastry. One of his visions was, let's acquire the Iris Vision technology and product from SGI, and let's make a company that's going to be very focused on making that product successful and then ultimately evolving it. So that's what the origins of Pellucid was, really more to make a run at selling the Iris Vision more successfully than SGI did. So I joined SGI because I knew Bharat, and Sanjay Iyer was the other founder of Pellucid, and I had worked in what was called the ESD division of SGI. And so they hired me as one of the earliest engineers to, evolve the technology. And in the early days of Pellucid, and I know I'm being long-winded here getting to your original question, but it
no,
kind of
that's
all mattered.
fine.
The Iris Vision thing didn't take off. So, similar for the reasons that SGI wasn't successful with it, Pellucid wasn't successful either because it was a misfit product. It was too expensive. Performance was not particularly good, largely limited by the ISA bus constraints. And so pretty quickly, even once Pellucid was up and running, it became clear, like, we got to do something new. And so actually one of the reasons that they hired me early on was to develop a 2D acceleration chip. This was back in the days when Windows accelerators were really starting to take off. So ATI, S3, Matrox? Yeah, Matrox.
Yes.
Waytech, I think, was another chip company, if I remember right. Diamond Multimedia was out there, hawking boards from Waytech's chip, et cetera. So this was a really pretty hot space, was this kind of Windows acceleration space. So that's why Pellucid hired me, was to create a Windows accelerator, which we did. And it was a great product. And ultimately, that's what caught the attention of MediaVision, was this Windows acceleration technology and products that we had created. So that's why MediaVision bought Lucid. So right around that acquisition, Ross, Gary, and I were very interested in developing 3D technology, based on our expertise from SGI. There's a lot of other things going on in the market that really gave us the conviction that it was time for 3D for the masses. And so we were starting to work on some ideas as to, let's develop a consumer 3D product. And we presented that to the MediaVision staff, and MediaVision had no interest in developing this thing and funding it. Right around that same time was when MediaVision imploded. So it was kind of the perfect time when, we had this passion. We wanted to develop a 3D product. MediaVision was imploding, and we said, fine, we're going to leave. We're going to do it on our own. That was the beginning. We left MediaVision in 94. Ross, Gary, and I started working on the concepts of 3dfx, and ultimately that was originally funded in the early part of 95. And right from the get-go, we really believe the secret to being successful as a 3D technology company was all about content. Developing technology, regardless of how good it was, if you didn't have the content, was meaningless. Our strong conviction was combining content with the technology was really the secret to success. And that's why the arcade market mattered so much to us early on. What we saw happening in the arcade space, all of these games that were originally developed in the arcade starting to come into the home consoles and, even starting to happen on the PC, that was a very strong trend. And so we saw one significant player that had some amount of technology, that was Sega. And Sega was arguably credited with proving, 3D matters for games. They came out with the Virtua series, Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing. Those were the first kind of real 3D games. And those were all on the arcade, but they did extremely well with that. And none of the other significant arcade manufacturers, Namco, Konami, Midway, none of those guys really had 3D technology. Capcom was another that they had Street Fighter series. So our idea was, let's create an arcade platform with chips, and ultimately we created this motherboard design also called an arcade PC. So it was basically a PC inside an arcade powered by 3dfx graphics. And let's create an arcade platform that we would sell to all of the non-Sega world. That was kind of the original business model and why the arcade side of it was so important to us.
You knew that all along, that you would focus on the arcade first and then transition to the PC market later.
Yeah, exactly right. And as the company, once we got funded and we started developing the original chipset and what eventually became known as Voodoo Graphics, pretty quickly we realized, why wait for the arcade thing? That was kind of continuing to percolate along. And yes, we were getting interest from those arcade manufacturers that, identified, but we were anxious that it was taking too long. The design cycles in the arcade were very long. We started to see the writing on the walls of what was going on the console side of things with, the Sony PlayStation, the PlayStation 2. 3D was coming. It was coming quickly. At that point, even though we never abandoned the interest in the arcade, but even before we had created the first generation Voodoo Graphics, we had already said, we're going to the PC world as quickly as we possibly can. And ultimately, the first products for Voodoo Graphics were introduced to the PC before the arcades. We sort of catapulted quickly into a PC-focused business.
Okay. Now, could you provide some more insight into the development process of the original Voodoo chipset? I guess it was the same for the arcades as it was then later for the PC. It was an add-in card in both cases, right? I read an interview somewhere where you said it was originally supposed to be a motherboard, but then you changed that into an add-in card. Is that correct?
Well, it didn't really matter in the arcade whether it was a board or, integrated directly on the motherboard. And I think ultimately it was different based on the different customers. For example, I remember like Midway, they had a whole motherboard that was, an integrated everything, including, the 3dfx graphics. And then I think other of our arcade customers ultimately chose to design it as a board. So we didn't really care in the arcade. And obviously in the PC space, it had to be an added board initially. we really felt strongly that it needed to be real 3D technology, not, a lot of the companies that were now starting to kind of play in this space, they were coming out of the Windows acceleration world. So, Matrox and ATI to some degree, S3, they were using, we kind of called it 2.5D techniques. So it was basically 2D technology that was, sort of used to do 3D, but it wasn't like real 3D. It wasn't, texture mapping wasn't correct, and you didn't have real gross shading, and you weren't really drawing triangles. You were drawing 2D objects and making it look like triangles. We felt if you're going to do 3D, you got to do it right. And again, it's all dating back to, what we knew from SGI about how content was created for 3D. You had to do real 3D polygonal graphics with all the bells and whistles, right? You had to draw triangles the right way. You had to do perspective correction on texture mapping, which was a big mistake that a lot of the other guys didn't do. Perspective correction, which meant it looked like crap. You had to do some amount of mapping and filtering on the textures. Otherwise, again, it just didn't look right. So if you didn't address all of those issues, we felt it was significantly limiting in terms of, how good does it look, and ultimately how interested our developer is going to be in developing to your platform. So when you looked at all those things together, you couldn't put all of these on a single chip. That was ultimately one of the, important early decisions we made, is that instead of trying to cram everything onto a single chip, which wouldn't have been economically viable, you would have had to make trade-offs. And you saw the trade-offs that came out of those other Windows accelerators. They only had so much die space to dedicate to 3D. It was just too little. And so ultimately the 3D that they were capable of delivering was very uninteresting. So by splitting it into a chipset, that allowed a lot more silicon area, and it allowed us to really deliver perspective correct texture mapping, bilinear filtering, true, Z buffering, gross shading, all these types of things that takes real silicon die area. And at the time, it was a lot of die area. The chipset approach was really important, and I think ultimately was, proved to be the right approach. That we were 10x better than anyone else out there in terms of performance and features. And then the other key element that we really thought hard about was scalability. If you think about, a single design that could scale from an arcade market down to lower cost PCs, well, how do you do that? You do that by making the chips themselves scale. And we created scalability within the texture mapping unit that allowed you to chain them together to, create trilinear mapping and other types of texture blending functions. That was really cool. And then we also created this technology that we coined as scanline interleaving, that you could, replicate entire subsystems to double the throughput by, having each subsystem render every other scan line. And so you could go from the minimalist set, which would be a 2-chip set for a PC, and that same design, just by instantiating more of these, you could have up to 3 texture units for every frame buffer unit. So that's a total of 4. And you could replicate that another 2x to do the scanline interleaving. So you could go from a basic 2-chip set in a PC up to a full-blown 8-chip set in the arcade and everything in between. So it was a really, admittedly, clever architecture. Design 2 chips, and you have all the scalability to address different price points and different performance requirements. And ultimately, there was a lot of tricks inside there. How do you do that? How do you make the chips communicate with each other? There's a huge amount of bandwidth requirement from chip to chip. We figured out very clever interfaces to do that. There's a lot of just innovation inside the chips in terms of how do you make scanline interleaving work. It's trickier than it sounds. So all this stuff, kind of came together in the original first generation Voodoo ones.
Looking at the pixel pipeline or the entire rendering pipeline, if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the Iris Vision boards from SGI, they were focusing on the first stage, the modeling, the 3D modeling, creating the polygons and transforming them. But the Iris Vision couldn't do texture mapping or something like that. Whereas the Voodoo chipset focused entirely on the last part, creating the pixels and the textures, and not doing any 3D modeling. That is up to the CPU. Why? Can you explain that? Why you didn't repeat the approach from the Iris Vision for the PC?
Well, so you're exactly right that the Iris Vision didn't support texture mapping. We certainly viewed texture mapping as a fundamental requirement to make gaming interesting, is to be able to add the texture mapping element for realism. And just to be clear, even though the Pellucid heritage had Iris Vision, ultimately the 3dfx technology that we created had nothing to do with Iris Vision. There wasn't any technology used or anything like that. We obviously learned about the market. I'd say, maybe the other learning that we had coming out of at least the understanding of how Iris Vision worked and some experience with is that SGI was always very much designing chipsets as opposed to single chips. And in the world of PCs, everyone was just designing single chips. There was this kind of mental barrier that I think a lot of the PC, Windows, et cetera, guys had, that they wouldn't even consider doing a chipset. That was too expensive or that was too complicated. And we came out of SGI, we're like, well, we do chipsets all the time. It's not that big of a deal to separate a texture unit from a frame buffer kind of controller. So we just followed sort of the logical way of doing it that way as well. And it also works out from a die size perspective and everything else. It's a pretty good split when you're trying to split a chip, to separate the frame buffer side of things, which would do grow shading, Z buffering, and the interface with the CPU, and having the texture engine completely separate, because that requires a lot of die size and space as well.
As far as I understand the architecture, the Iris Vision, the original SGI products, they were only doing the 3D modeling stage, creating the polygons and reshaping the polygons, but not the texturing part. So you switched that, as far as I understand the process, with the Voodoo chipset, and the Voodoo doesn't do any polygon calculations.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yes. So yes, you're correct that the original Iris Vision did the geometry processing on a chip, which was on the board. And you're exactly right. First of all, a geometry processor in and of itself is a very complex thing to design. And, in the era that we were designing the original Voodoo 1, this was right as the time that Intel was coming out with some very impressive new CPUs, right? The Pentium series was just coming out. And one of the most important aspects of those Intel architectures was very fast floating point calculations. Before Pentium was introduced, a lot of the early 46s had floating point coprocessors, and they were even when you had that coprocessor, it was very slow. So when Pentium came out, they dramatically improved the floating point calculations. And that was also a big kind of light bulb moment for us. And really credit to Gary Tiroli, who recognized this, that we can actually do all this complex geometry processing on a Pentium CPU. And it's really capable now that it's got this rip and fast floating point capability. So why do we want to reinvent the wheel there? Just let the CPU do all that. And it's also, those geometry calculations were very amenable to a general purpose CPU so long as the performance was there, because what you really want to bake into silicon are things that are more fixed function in nature, data path, and those types of things that require a lot of complex logic and branches and loops and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of more inherent to geometry processing. Those are hard to put in fixed function type of things that we were designing. And so it sort of solved the problem. Let's do that in software. We now have a platform in the Pentium, which was obviously going to revolutionize the PC. And then we can worry about kind of more the fixed function elements of 3D. And let's bake those elements into silicon with the original Voodoo 1. That was a market dynamic that was going on in the PC. The other thing in terms of our vision for what we wanted to build, we were at SGI when SGI developed the reality engine. And if you remember that product, that was a revolutionary product that brought true perspective correct filtered texture mapping to the market. We said we believe we can put the reality engine on a chipset in a PC, and people thought we were crazy. That's exactly what we did. Some of that was just silicon technology had advanced to the point that you had a lot more silicon transistors to use. That was part of it. But it also came down to very clever algorithms in the world of professional graphics that you need, super high fidelity. Everything had to be very wide precision and everything to have it, very, very pixel accurate, if you will. What we recognized early on when we developed the Voodoo series was this is for gaming. You don't need full 32-bit floating point math. we can actually create our own internal floating point formats that are good enough for gaming, because you already knew it's going to be a smaller resolution and the ultimate accuracy could be a little bit less, because so long as it looked okay, and even if it was mathematically a little bit off, didn't matter, because the only test that mattered was the eye test, right, for gaming. And so inside the Voodoo pipelines, we created all sorts of our own unique width of numbers that we would hold, our unique floating point formats. Since this was all inside the chips, it never was exposed, if you will, to the outside world. You could play these games. And the other kind of major decision that we made was that at the time, you didn't really need true 32-bit color to be stored in the frame buffer. So the original Voodoo 1 and actually Voodoo 2 was all 16-bit dithered. Again, the only thing that mattered was the eye test, and 16-bit dithered looks pretty darn good. And so that shaved a lot of cost and a lot of bandwidth by making that, arguably hard decision. We're just going to focus on really good 16-bit dithered frame buffers. And so long as it looks good enough, who cares, right? And so that was another kind of right decision at the time, given all the trade-offs of memory bandwidth and memory storage and, how many transistors do you have to play with, et cetera, et cetera. So that was like another really key element that we decided on.
It seems like 3dfx was always focused on providing the best experience with current generation games, like using 16-bit because it's simply good enough, whereas Nvidia seemed to be focusing or implementing features for future games like 32-bit colors or transformer lighting and other features that weren't actually being used by games yet, but they helped with marketing. So it seems, at least that's my impression, that 3dfx focused on providing the best experience for the games that are available right now. And Nvidia was more focusing on introducing new technology that they could use for marketing purposes and for upcoming games, but without any real usability.
I'm not sure I would agree with that completely. I mean, I think ultimately the divergence between 3dfx and Nvidia was really more about what market segments that we were each targeting. 3dfx remained first and foremost focusing on the high-end gaming experience and then developing technology for that and then having that propagate down to more volume products. Nvidia, once they got past the mistakes of NV1 and NV2 and realized like we need to build a really good polygonal 3D engine, and that was the original NV3.
Yeah.
Nvidia's philosophy was very much focused on the PC OEM space. They thought of themselves more as a traditional PC chip company that was, obviously pioneering with 3D, but more as a competitor, I think, to S3 at the time than to say 3dfx, right? Who was much more focused on the content side and the super high end and all that kind of stuff. So it was really different philosophy, but ultimately, at some point it just became who executed better. Right. And so Nvidia took a leap forward first with that NV3, where they now had an integrated 2D, 3D capability that, not only did good 2D, but then did real 3D, meaning, all the things that I talked about with texture mapping and polygonal shading and all the other stuff. Nvidia was probably credited with developing the first real 2D, 3D chip. We were working on that. That was ultimately the chip that was internally known as Banshee.
Yeah.
But we did not execute very well on that. And ultimately, it wasn't a vision thing. It was just an execution thing. And that's, in retrospect, that's one of the more frustrating aspects that I have about 3dfx. What if, right? What if the world would have been very different if we would have gotten Banshee out under its original time frame, because we would have been first to market. We already had the brand name recognition. We had the momentum. And Banshee would, ultimately was a very good PC OEM chip, and we would have beat Nvidia to the punch and probably would have killed Nvidia. If you know the Nvidia story, they were down to their, very few employees. They had no money. If NV3 came back from the fab, from TSMC, and had any flaw with it, they would have died. They didn't have the money to fix it or to keep going. So talk about threading the needle, they ultimately did. And then, they really built from there. They hired a couple of very good guys from SGI to develop, what ultimately became the first GPU and integrated geometry processing engine with, along with the 2D and 3D. Our approach was, again, to develop a chipset. We were working on the next generation 2D, 3D accelerator, which was called Rampage. Mm-hmm. And in parallel with that, we were working on a separate geometry engine that was called Sage. So we were still focusing on sort of a high-end, very scalable. Again, it had all the, SLI stuff that I talked about. If you wanted like extreme geometry horsepower, you could have multiple Sage chips. So we were still in this philosophy of developing common building block chips, and then we could have all sorts of different board incarnations to serve various different market segments. And again, it wasn't a difference in vision. I think we and Nvidia were pretty aligned in terms of what we wanted to build next, et cetera, et cetera. Frankly, Nvidia just did a better job of execution. They got the chips out sooner. They, I think, had a better good enough philosophy than we did. I think we wanted to keep building really cool stuff, and we weren't as good as Nvidia was to say, let's build something good enough, let's get it out to market, and take smaller steps towards improve it, as opposed to kind of bigger steps. But ultimately, they out executed us, and that ultimately was a huge advantage for them.
But you could say that the steps 3dfx made with your several generations of Voodoo chipsets, those steps weren't that big, because Voodoo 2 was basically Voodoo graphics with an additional texture unit, and Voodoo 3 was basically Banshee with an additional texture unit, wasn't it?
I mean, the difference between Voodoo 1 and Voodoo 2 architecturally wasn't that great, but there was huge performance boost from that. Some of it was productizing it with the second texture unit. So, when we worked with Diamond and Creative Labs and all the board manufacturers, we really pushed that they should productize the 2 texture unit architecture. And that had huge performance improvements in terms of just texture throughput and being able to do real-time trilinear mapping and all those kinds of things. When you develop something and you actually then release it to market and you actually start to see like how it's working in the real world, you learn a lot. And so Voodoo 2 had a number of enhancements that combined together just made it a much, much faster architecture than Voodoo 1. I shouldn't say architecture, call it an implementation, because the architecture is pretty similar to Voodoo 1. It was just sort of the architecture fully realizing the capability. And so it was a big step up. And, that was obviously, one of the reasons I think that Voodoo 2 was so popular was just the huge performance gains, as well as some of the content that we'll get into in a minute that was coming out at the same time. But then I think it was Voodoo 3 was basically Banshee. So Banshee was a single texture unit with all the frame buffer stuff and 2D. And that was the first Voodoo 3. By the time that came out, it had some limitations because it was kind of too little too late. It didn't do trilinear mapping because it only had one texture unit in it. And that was kind of a bit of a limitation. And it also didn't do kind of true 32-bit 3D. It was still doing 16-bit dithered stuff. The Nvidia chip, I think it was now NV4 that we were competing against. It did all those things. So right. And then, okay, now we're scrambling to let's do Voodoo 4, which ultimately fix those things. We got Voodoo 4 out pretty quickly, but now we were really playing catch up in at least in the PC space. Nvidia was just kind of a step ahead of us on some of those decisions that we made, because we just couldn't keep up with them, frankly, in terms of getting those chips out there as quickly as Nvidia was executing. Even if, say, Banshee was late, and that really hurt us in the PC OEM space. Similarly, Rampage, if it would have come out when it was expected to, that was another opportunity to sort of save 3dfx. That chip was amazing, but by the time that Rampage was ready to go, 3dfx was having real problems financially. We were very close. It was about to be taped out.
Oh,
before,
really? Okay.
Sorry, it had taped out. Yes, it had taped out right as we made the decision to sell to Nvidia. So we were right on the cusp of having real Rampage, but we just ran out of runway financially.
What do you guess? How close were you to reaching mass production with Rampage?
It was just being brought up in the lab, as I recall. It's one of these things you just look back and you shake your head. It's just like, oh my gosh, even if we had a couple more months, Rampage could have been fully up and running in the lab, and then you could find ways to raise more money because this thing was amazing. I don't remember all the details, but it was pretty healthy. It was unfortunate we just ran out of time, because a couple more months and the world could have been quite different. We had not yet taped out the geometry chip, so the Sage chip. If we would have found a way to give another 6 months of life to 3dfx, which would have allowed Rampage to probably have gotten into production and Sage would have been taped out and hopefully healthy, it would have been a very different story for 3dfx. We would have had an incredibly competitive offering relative to what Nvidia had at the time.
Regarding
We were
the
very
Rampage
close.
and Sage, there is a lot of rumors and speculations online in the still strong 3dfx community, especially in Germany. And
Yep.
I talked to one of the guys from the German 3dfx scene. He's actually one of the owners of one of those famous Voodoo 6000 boards with 4 chips.
Awesome.
Yes,
Those are great. Yeah.
those are
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
amazing. And he just sent me a list of rumored specifications for the Rampage chip. And I don't know if you can remember if those were true or if you can confirm those. And he said one of the rumored capabilities was Pixel Shader 1.0. I guess.
Yep.
Yeah, sounds
Yep.
reasonable.
In fact, that was one of the things that we were super jazzed about was, a pixel shading capability, and it was quite advanced. It would have been the first, kind of real pixel shading 3D chip out there.
You also mentioned sparse grid multi-sampling anti-aliasing. Would that be possible with the Rampage?
That's correct. Yep. There was exceptionally good anti-aliasing in it. Yep.
And 16:1 trilinear anisotropic filtering.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it was 16:1. It would have been the first anisotropic filtering chip as well. So you can imagine the visual quality with the anisotropic filtering and the advanced anti-aliasing. I mean, it was beautiful. Some of the simulations that we had on this stuff it was gorgeous. And throw in pixel shading. I mean, it was an awesome chip.
Ah, what a shame that it couldn't live.
It's just a shame. Yeah. I know when I look back on this stuff, and like I said, if we just would have had another 6 months, with the geometry engine coming, with that had, I would say probably vertex shading 1.0 kind of things in it too. Like from a technology perspective, we were right there. And then, the other thing that was in the pipeline coming, which would have been really cool, was if you remember, 3dfx acquired a company called Gigapixel.
Yes, of course.
And we were, working on integrating the gigapixel technology into, you can think about it as the follow-on to Rampage. And that was quite far along in its development. That also would have been, very transformative for the 3D world, because if you remember back in that day and age, there was kind of two different camps on how you do 3D. One was the, what's called immediate mode rendering, which is, basically the way that 3dfx and Nvidia and pretty much the, SGI, like everyone did immediate mode rendering, meaning you get a triangular render and you do all the whatever you do to it, and you ultimately output it to the frame buffer, and you keep doing that. Another technique was called deferred rendering. And PowerVR, if you remember those guys, they were one of the first to productize deferred rendering. And Gigapixel, their technology was based on deferred rendering. Now, deferred rendering is interesting because instead of, every polygon that you receive, you process through the pipeline and you output it to the frame buffer, et cetera, et cetera. In deferred rendering, you capture the entire frame worth of polygons. So you have to have an entire frame of information first. As you're collecting these things, you're not actually rendering them, you're just kind of storing them in a buffer. And once you receive that full frame level information, so you have all the polygons in the frame, then you render them. Now, the advantage of that is that instead of actually rendering them into a frame buffer, when you do deferred rendering, you can do this internally. So you basically chunk up the entire frame. For example, if you're running at, at the time, 1280 resolution was kind of the high end of what you could practically do with decent performance. You carve up that 1280 1024 screen into chunks of, say, 64 by 64 or 128 by 128. And that is a small enough area that you can do all of that on chip. So, there's no hit for, things like Z buffering. There's no hit for anti-aliasing, because you now have this, in essence, infinite bandwidth on chip to be able to do all these different type of techniques. Deferred rendering is hard to get right. And there are some cases where there's some incompatibilities if a game assumes, immediate mode rendering. But that was the Gigapixel technology was based on deferred rendering. And that's what we were working on as a follow-on to Rampage. And I think given the leverage and brand and connections with the content community that 3dfx had, I think we would have ultimately, been very successful making deferred rendering kind of the way of doing 3D for games. Would have been interesting.
Yes,
Ultimately,
absolutely.
PowerVR's kind of had some success with this too, because PowerVR ultimately was sold to Imagination Technologies. It's now the name of the
Yes.
company, which I think is still an independent company. Some of that stuff over time was licensed to like Apple. So for a while, it was all based on that PowerVR technology. So it was all deferred rendering, within those Apple chips, I believe.
Really interesting. I have one more question about Rampage, and then if you still have time, I would like to ask a few questions about content as well, because of course that's really interesting as well and really important.
Yep.
The last question I got from the Voodoo community about Rampage was its fabrication process. Was it 180 or maybe under 150 nanometers planned for production?
It was 180.
Okay.
Yeah. The follow-on, the one that was going to be based on the gigapixel technology, that was based on 150 nanometer.
Okay. Of course, you opted not to choose Direct 3D or only use Direct 3D or OpenGL or 3DR from Intel or something else, but you created Glide. But how did you convince the game developers to use Glide, something that wasn't really available, and I guess it wasn't really finished when you were approaching the game designers?
Well, first and foremost, if you remember again in the time, this is 1995, Direct 3D didn't exist. And also, if you remember kind of our grand vision that we wanted to create a platform that, games could be introduced into the arcade and then eventually propagate down to the PC. Of course, being able to do that meant you need an API that spanned across all those different platforms. And then, we even had, even at that time, visions of like, well, what are we going to do on a Mac? And, what about non-PC environment? And we also, a whole nother conversation we could talk about briefly if you want, is sort of the whole console space.
Yes.
That, what if you wanted to create a console, what API is that? And all that kind of stuff. And so Glide made a ton of sense because you needed a cross-platform API. And at the time, OpenGL was just kind of becoming real, but it was also extremely heavy. And we felt it was much more than was needed for games. And also OpenGL at the time also had a number of limitations. Like you couldn't do some of the things that you wanted to do at the polygonal level just because of the OpenGL interface in and of itself. So what we built with Glide was basically obviously abstracting, but then also exposing just a rip and fast rendering interface. And that was one of the things that game developers told us early on, even before we had created Glide or created the original Voodoo 1, was, just give us a really fast rendering interface. That's all we really want. And that's ultimately what Glide was. And so I think by building what developers told us they wanted, that kind of enamored them to Glide. It worked. It was fast. It was, pretty straightforward. And so that's why I think it was, so successful. Something like Intel 3DR, Intel in the software world has always been they're always a little bit off. 3DR did some things, they didn't do some things. Intel was just kind of lukewarm behind it. You didn't really know, how serious it was going to be. There was a number of things that we did in the Voodoo 1 that, did some cool things that 3DR didn't expose. So, for all those reasons, like, well, let's just build our own. And so ultimately that was, I think, a really big part of our early success because developers loved Glide. It was exactly what they wanted. And then, as time went on, Glide was very successful, but then eventually Microsoft, they developed DirectX, which initially was more 2D and multimedia focused, but then they eventually augmented that with Direct 3D. And, at some point it became clear that, of course, you wanted to support Direct 3D because it's the Windows platform and Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't really view Direct 3D as competition per se. We just viewed it as, an API that you have to support because if games want to use Direct 3D, they should. We kept going and evolving Glide because we always felt that we would have something that was always a bit more leading edge. We could always expose our latest and greatest features through our own API and get those to market without being beholden to Microsoft or anyone else that was defining more industry standard APIs.
Yeah, and you also needed something for DOS games, right? And Direct 3D was only for Windows, obviously.
That's exactly right. In the early days, DOS mattered. And, we even had back in those days, some people that wanted to use Linux and, different crazy OSs that existed in the arcade space and the Mac OS equivalent at the time. So there's definitely a lot of other OSs that we wanted to target that obviously Direct3D didn't address, or 3DR.
Yeah. There are a lot of rumors about the origins of Glide, and part of this is because of the similar name. Glide with the capital L just looks and sounds like OpenGL. Are they related in any kind? Was Glide somewhat inspired by OpenGL, or not at all?
Well, I mean, to some degree, yes and no. Gary Tiroli, our other founder, he was very involved with the creation of OpenGL. And in fact, he wrote a book on it. So, Gary really knew APIs and knew how to create them, knew how to spec them, was a true expert there. The naming, GL just stands for graphics language.
Yeah,
so, there's nothing, kind of, you're right. Sorry, you're right. It's library.
Yeah.
Thank you for the correction. And so that just sort of made sense. I don't think Glide meant anything. I don't think it was an acronym. I think it was sort of like, okay, it's GL something. There must be a story. Maybe Ross remembers how Glide was originally created, but no, it didn't have anything to do with OpenGL. Yeah, it's a cool name. Yeah, it kind of sounds cool, right? And it's a little bit like, how do you come up with names? A lot of it just comes down to, does it sound and feel right, and all those kinds of things. Gary obviously had a lot of experience, with OpenGL, but ultimately it was actually one of our early software engineers that created Glide, a guy by the name of Brian Hook. Was ultimately, who spec'd and implemented the first incarnation of Glide. Gary sort of oversaw it, but it wasn't Gary's thing. It was Brian's thing more than anything else. And so, kind of unrelated to OpenGL proper.
So you somehow managed to convince a lot of developers to use Glide, but the killer app for the Voodoo graphics cards maybe was not based on Glide at all. It was GL Quake. Or would you say it was something else? Was it more a Tomb Raider? Or what was the killer app for the first generation of Voodoo cards?
I'd say definitely Tomb Raider was one. Tomb Raider was pure Glide. I remember the original developers, I think a company out of France or something.
Oh, British guys.
Was it British? Yeah,
Yes.
okay, maybe it was. But the first time we ever saw this, we were just blown away. We're like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. And that was all Glide. And, one of the reasons I think that we were so successful early on was we had hired 2 or 3 kind of gaming guys. Like Brian Hook was one, Gary McTaggart was another. These were gaming guys. And so they were developing these really cool demos for us. And so, if you remember the early days of 3dfx, we had these really cool demos. Yes. And, we gave all that away to the game developers, basically teaching them how to do 3D, how to use Glide, all that kind of stuff. And so that was very empowering. It allowed us to kind of show off how good 3dfx could look. Because that was actually one of the early challenges we had, is that game developers they didn't even really understand 3D. And even if they did, it was really basic 3D. So we really felt we needed to show them with the eyeballs, this is the kind of stuff you can do when you really use all the capabilities. And so that was one of the reasons that we hired those guys. And then we had an excellent developer relations, very small team. One of the earliest guys named Brian Bruning. And Brian was amazing. He had these connections with the game developers. And I think he somehow found those original Tomb Raider creators. And, we seeded them with boards and we taught them how to, use Glide, et cetera, et cetera. And then we were just ecstatic when we saw the earliest incarnations of Tomb Raider, because they really bought into, we're not going to develop a game that suits all platforms and can run on everything from an S3 Verge to some ATI thing to some 3dfx thing. We're just going to build a game 100% utilizing the capabilities of 3dfx and require a 3dfx board. And you saw the end result of that. It was like, wow, what a step forward that had for 3D gaming in general. So that was one aspect of it. And then you mentioned Quake. So, we had been talking with John Carmack at id for a long time about, getting him to port the first incarnation of Quake, which of course was all software rendering, port that to 3dfx hardware. And John is, he's so smart and he thinks so strategically. His perspective on it was, well, if I'm going to do this, I don't want to do just a Glide version. I want to do something that actually can run on more hardware than just Glide. And so he actually chose OpenGL as the API that he wanted to program to. And doing a full port, if you will, or support for the full-blown OpenGL language was a ton of work, and we felt very unnecessary for the gaming world. So what we created along with Carmack was what we called MiniGL, which was basically a subset of OpenGL. So the original Quake used this MiniGL, and the way that it actually worked for us is MiniGL sat on top of Glide. So it was just kind of a layering, but ultimately still ran through Glide. And his first port for Quake was, writing to the MiniGL using the Voodoo 2. When we first saw it running, our heads exploded because it was so, and even Carmack was like, this is amazing. Like, he then, as brilliant as he was with his, software rendering algorithms, he immediately saw the future, and he's like, screw that software rendering stuff. This is everything we're doing going forward is going to be based on full hardware support needed. He defined a pretty high threshold in terms of the hardware capabilities that they would only support. So a lot of the existing quote 3D chips out there like Verge and the ATI stuff and Matrox, he wouldn't support because they didn't have enough of the capabilities that he and we agreed were the kind of been necessary to do kind of real 3D in general. So, and obviously, I couldn't quantify, but Quake support for Voodoo 2, that created hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue for us was just Quake. I mean, that was the killer app, no question about it. Oh. And then the other, in addition to Tomb Raider, we established a partnership with EA. EA decided that they were also going to natively support Glide in a number of their games. And, that was purely a business relationship. We didn't pay them. It was just, hey guys, we're the best 3D graphics platform on the PC. Your games can be that much better if you write natively to Glide. And, we convinced them to do that. And I don't remember how many games it was like 6 or 7 games that were all Glide native. If you think about Tomb Raider, Quake, and then those EA games, all those together, I think, just gave 3dfx a big advantage on the content side.
Yes, absolutely. Especially in the first years when DOS gaming was still big in 96 and 97. And then Unreal was big as well. That ran fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. When Tim Sweeney first introduced that. And again, I mean, this was, if you think about it, it took some courage, and Sweeney did the same thing as Carmack did. Is at some point when Sweeney was developing the Unreal Engine, he said, we're going to require real hardware acceleration. And so, to some degree, he focused on a smaller total available market, right? He didn't support all those 2.5D chips, and he didn't support software rendering, but he made a huge step forward because he built it with real 3D required, like 3dfx production. 3dfx was kind of the only game in town at that point. Huge success for him and us at the same time. You're right. Unreal was another one. It was a little bit later, but that was another killer app at the time.
98, and then there was Unreal Tournament, which also ran best on the Voodoo series, or even better than the GeForce 2.
Exactly.
I personally remember seeing Unreal for the very first time running on a Voodoo 2. This was really amazing, being used to software rendering at the time, and it was eye-opening.
Yep. Those were fun days, no doubt. I mean, just because I remember back in 1990, my first job out of college was at SGI. And the first time I ever saw, a reality engine doing its thing, flight simulators and that kind of stuff, my eyes just exploded. I'm like, this is amazing. And I remember when we first launched Voodoo Graphics and then ultimately Voodoo 2, just reading the chat forums and what people said, it's like I plugged this thing in and my mind exploded. I've never seen anything so cool. Like that's, those types of things, only kind of happen once in life where you just take such a dramatic step forward and people had never seen, a computer do these types of things. So that's so immensely satisfying to all of us. And I think that's one of the reasons that, people still really love 3dfx and, spend time, the community that you mentioned, et cetera, is because it meant something in their lives. It really did. It was one of those kind of, I don't want to say life-changing because that's probably too strong, but, a very memorable part of all of our lives was the first time that we saw this type of technology and, the pleasure that it brought people, the visual experience, the games that were created. None of those things were possible before this all kind of came together. So, that gives us immense satisfaction that we still hold that special place in people's, hearts and minds. And it was a meaningful business to be a part of.
Are you still playing PC games these days?
Not so much, honestly. Even back in 3dfx, honestly, I've never been a big gamer. I like to kind of play around, if you will, meaning like I like the visual experience, but I spend more time looking at the visual aspects and that aspect of it than I do about the gameplay itself. I've never been a big gamer per se. I love the technology behind it, but not as much on the pure gaming side.
You're missing out on some really fantastic games.
Yeah, I know. I know. Well, especially in today's day and age. Oh my
Yes,
gosh, there's just so much.
absolutely.
But my son in particular, of course, is now 21, but just watching him grow up through the years and, buying various PC cards and game consoles and stuff and just, enjoy the gaming world and, just being able to connect with him in terms of talking about graphics and how things have evolved. That's been fun.
Okay, that's it then. This is all the questions I have, and you were really generous with your time and with your really helpful answers. This is fascinating stuff.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and thank you for your time
Perfect.
again. Scott already answered different questions, but he still managed to answer a few of those, telling me something about the beginnings, the early days of 3dfx. But something he did not tell me was the name. Who came up with the name 3dfx, and wasn't this kind of limiting what you were able to do with the company, just doing 3D stuff, I guess? No 2D accelerators, no CPUs.
Well, so I came up with the name. I also came up with a name for Voodoo Graphics.
That's an entirely different topic in a minute. Yeah.
3dfx at the time, I mean, this was a long time ago. 3D was not nearly as popular, and the fact that we were bringing, in effect, visual effects, via 3D into the gaming space, we thought that the name communicated really what we were up to. We were really focused on 3D. I don't know if Scott told you, but in the first chips, we only had features that were relevant for games.
Yes,
We didn't
absolutely.
even have a line drawing engine, and we weren't doing, really high precision rendering. One of the alternate names for the company could have been No CAD, because Gary was adamant we're not doing CAD. So no line drawing, no stippled lines, none of that stuff. And some of that stuff got added over time to become OpenGL compliant. But in the early days, it was really a laser focus on games and 3dfx, and Voodoo Graphics lent itself to that aspect.
The voodoo part, why is it called voodoo graphics? Voodoo is, first and
Magic.
foremost, it's a religion. So it's an interesting choice.
Yes, but at least to a lot of people, voodoo represents a form of magic, dark magic, potentially, right? And so what we were trying to do in 3D graphics for games was to bring this dark magic of really powerful 3D technology into a place where it had never been before. So if you think about Santeria and how it took over in the Caribbean, it's the same kind of thing. It's voodoo, right? And we wanted, not to have a concept of a CAD graphics card, or, it was entirely focused on games. And Voodoo made sense for that.
It does. And it was kind of magical using or seeing.
Best name I've ever done. I've had 15 companies, but there's no name better than Voodoo Graphics. That was just perfect.
Do you remember any other names that you were discussing for the graphics chipset?
It was originally called SST.
Yeah, that's the internal name, right?
Yeah.
SST1.
And but if you've done marketing before, you know that don't pick a name until you're really sure about it, because it's really hard to change. So we kept it as SST for the longest time, trying to figure out a good name. And we used to have these brainstorming sessions around sake and sushi way back when. Somehow Voodoo Graphics came up. I tossed it out there because SIGGRAPH at one point in time was held in New Orleans, and I was thinking about SIGGRAPH for a moment. So anyway, the more we thought about it, the more everyone liked it. And Scott actually was a little apprehensive, maybe Gary too, because it does have a dark connotation.
It does.
But the gamers loved it, man, and the game developers loved it. So worked.
Yeah, graphics cards names were always kind of dark in the 90s. They were always called Destroyer or Eraser or something dark and powerful like that.
Yeah.
So it fit perfectly. Yeah, it's a great name. Well, you kept it around until Voodoo 5, but then I think the generation that was supposed to come out after Voodoo 5 was Spectre, I guess, which is another pretty cool name.
I left 3dfx fairly early on to take the technology into the precision world. But and so some of those latter decisions, I don't even remember what Spectre was now.
It was the Rampage and Sage
Oh,
one, but
okay,
yeah.
all right, yeah. So I'm sure Scott told you about the problems with those chips, but I
Yes,
mean
he did.
that was in effect the death of the company. Anyway, I wasn't involved in Spectre, but Voodoo was mine actually.
But you were involved with getting in touch with games developers, right? And with
Oh yeah, I wrote the business plan and came up with the business model. So what we were trying to do is create an ecosystem, much like you have with Nintendo or PlayStation, right? Where you've got game developers, platform, and Microsoft and Intel were conveniently provided us with a great platform. So we had millions of potential users out there if we could get a product out, but we knew that games were the key. Any initial study of the marketplace tells you that it all comes down to the game. Early on, we decided to do game recruitment. And so I had a really good marketing person work with me, and we decided to hire a team of people to go talk to game developers. And we did that. I mean, in the early days, it was typically Scott and me, or Gary and me, or Scott and Gary would go visit a game developer. But then we put together one of the first formal programs to recruit them to an open platform. I remember like when the game developer conference was like held in a hotel. It was tiny, and we'd have a party and everything to try and get game developers.
But you started with contacting arcade game developers, right? Not PC game developers, because you
That's right.
first.
That was the initial entree. It was going to be in the arcade. So there were plenty of trips I recall with Scott or Gary and me off to Japan. We spent a lot of time in Japan. If you're going to be in the arcade, you got to have Taito, Konami, Capcom, all those guys. And we pitched Namco and Sega and everyone. We did a different deal with Sega at one point in time, but we could never get them in the arcade. But we got pretty much everyone else, which was pretty good.
Yeah, later on, you had an Atari arcade game based on 3dfx technology.
Oh yeah, I
The
mean
hockey game.
we had Atari. So Midway and Atari were connected. The
Mhm.
companies were converged, and so we won Midway early on, and Atari was just a natural because actually the Midway Atari team is pretty much the same guys working on different style games. So if you're Atari, you're doing driving games and stuff like that. That was a good win for us.
But the Japanese companies, they weren't interested for
Oh
some
no,
reason.
no, we won Taito, Capcom, Konami, all those guys. We didn't win Sega for the arcade because they had a deal with Real 3D. They did an original deal with Lockheed, and then that became Real 3D, and then Intel bought that. That's who Sega had used for their arcade platform. But the whole strategy was to penetrate the arcade where we could tolerate a little bit more price as purchased by the operators and the manufacturers, because at the time when we started the company, memory was really expensive. The key factors in the success of the company is that by the time we had silicon, memory had gone down in price by a huge amount. So much so that we actually entered the consumer market, and I think you had a question about this, much, much earlier than we thought we would. We thought we'd have a couple of years in the arcade, build up a good portfolio of games, and by then we'd be able to cost reduce the product and introduce it into the retail market. But what happened is by the time we got, the Voodoo 1, silicon had come down a little bit, but memory had gone through the floor. So what we thought would be probably a $500 or $1,000 board, we could get down to under $300 through Orchid and Diamond and those guys. And that's a magic price point. But that happened primarily because of the cost of memory. And we had also developed a pretty cool compression technology that let us use, a smaller amount of texture memory and still provide really good visual effects.
Yeah, I checked the development of the Edo RAM price, and indeed, it was 1 year. I cannot remember the exact dates. I have it written down somewhere, but it dropped 80% within 1 year, and it's really amazing. So,
And so,
yeah.
I mean, it wasn't some brilliant marketing. When we had a good business plan, it was working. But that was a precipitous event that the entire graphics industry benefited from. But it really helped us.
So you weren't really expecting to enter the PC gaming market until what,
No.
97, 98, maybe?
I have a hard time remembering those dates. It's all a blur to me. But
Okay, yeah.
we started developing the architecture, and we didn't even engage with consumer level games for a while. There's a network of game developers, And so we started hearing from people out in the gaming community saying, hey, we hear you got this thing. What is this thing? That's a great aspect about game developers, is because they're all looking for technological advantage. And we had a very believable story, especially with the people that we had on the team, where they came from and what we were attempting. It was a very believable story. And then we did some things to make it more credible. Like one of the first things that we did, Gary created a simulator for the chip that would basically provide the actual visual quality and capability. We would render a scene, right? And then we could show that in, real time during playback. And it was rendered at low resolution, but you could see the effect. And we lugged that computer around. It was a Pentium 90 that weighed about 400 pounds. We lugged this thing all over Japan and into Europe, into game developers here, showing people, here's what the rendering quality is going to look like. It's going to be in real time. And they said, okay, that's interesting. And then we also then built an actual emulator that ran on a Silicon Graphics workstation, ran on a reality engine. And that was like the next step. And then we bought a few of those and sprinkled those around to the development community. We didn't give them to them, but we'd loan them to them so they could get their code over. And by the time we had Silicon, we had a bunch of games.
Which ones were some of the first games that you had based on Glide?
Actua Soccer,
Mm-hmm.
Tomb Raider.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Tomb Raider was kind of one of my personal favorites. I love the lighting in that game from way back when.
Yeah. Scott is a huge Tomb Raider fan as well.
Yeah.
He told me yesterday.
Papyrus, we all loved that game because it had such a different look. It wasn't a first-person shooter. It wasn't a driving game. It was just cool. And especially to basically post-adolescent boys. It's a really cool game. Papyrus had a flight simulator or a driving simulator. I can't remember which one. We had a kind of something from every category. We had like Actua Soccer. We had a fighting game.
Yeah.
We had a first-person shooter. Quake actually came a little bit later, but we had
that was 97.
Maybe Wolfenstein. I don't remember what it was. I think there might have been a baseball game, and then like a driving game and a flight simulator. And the biggest initial game was probably Actua Soccer. We had a good collection of games, and it got better much faster.
Yeah.
And then once Quake hit, the party was over for everyone else. That was the big thing, because you had to have Voodoo graphics to run Quake.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think you already had a pretty impressive lineup on E3 in 96. So that was half a year before, or 5 months before Voodoo Graphics even launched, and you already had something like 15 to 20 games running on this silicon, which is really impressive.
We were entirely focused, which is an essential thing for a startup. We weren't trying to do 12 things. We were doing one thing, and it was very unifying.
And then you already mentioned Quake. There is a lot of conflicting information how that happened, because some people say, well, or some sources claim that 3dfx made a version of Quake that ran on top of Glide, the mini GL version. And
no, we didn't do that. We built mini GL, but that was all it that did that. We didn't.
But it was based on the OpenGL version that John Carmack did without 3dfx input, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so he started with the OpenGL version. I think he posted something in around Christmas in 96, and he said something like, I ported Quake over to OpenGL on Windows last weekend just for fun, I guess. And then you guys started working on MiniGL to make it run on top of Glide. So
we had many meetings with them long before that.
Oh, okay, you did.
Showing them what was happening, and my brain is foggy on this because it's just so long ago.
Yeah, it's 30
but
years.
I know that basically Gary and John had a really good relationship, based on technical, acumen. So we actually hired a guy to do the mini GL, and it was enough of OpenGL. I think we may have had an OpenGL license as well. I know we did it at the predecessor company.
At Pellucid.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, the mini GL had, just those essential features that we needed to run Quake, and also some other applications. Like you could run a lot of OpenGL applications against that. You just couldn't do CAD very well. And then we ultimately started emulating those CAD functions also, because some of the simulation games wanted them. But anyway, it did the port of Quake to GL. and then we did the mini GL layer to provide compatibility on top of Glide.
Okay, but there was some kind of cooperation between
Oh
it
yeah,
and
oh yeah,
3dfx.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we would release a version and then they would give us some feedback and we'd tweak it or whatever. And then it changed over time. So it had a life. If I'm not mistaken, I think Brian Hook worked on that, but I don't, if you know that name.
Yes,
He
he
posts
he
quite a
made
bit.
Glide. Yeah.
Yeah. He and I think Miriam Sedman worked on the mini GL, but Gary or Scott may know, but it's too far in my memory banks.
Well, that's fine.
Yeah.
And then John Carmack, eventually he joined the 3dfx advisory board.
Yes.
Was he paid for that? Was he basically working for 3dfx? It's a
Not
weird
working,
position.
but and it wasn't paid. You know, they did get some stock options, and that's typical. We also had people from like University of North Carolina and and Stanford, having people that are very knowledgeable in different aspects of the industry, whether it's rendering or the game business or whatever, is very helpful to have on the advisory board. And Carmack is a super knowledgeable person and intimately
Yeah.
familiar with all aspects of the game world and immensely respected. So having him
Mhm.
on the advisory board made perfectly good sense. We're always asking, people that are game developers, and as clever as John is, what features are you looking for next, right? What do we do next? Do we focus on anti-aliasing? Do we focus on more texture memory? What's driving that? And having an advisory board when you're doing silicon like that is really important, so you know what features are going to be important to your core constituent, which is the game developer.
And then Brian Hook, who developed Glide, I think he joined id Software later.
Yes, he
So
did. Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. So there is a lot of connections between the two companies. And would you say that GL Quake and Quake basically running on 3dfx hardware, it was the killer app that pushed
I
you
think
to the
so.
top?
I think
Mhm.
so. I mean, I can't think of any other game that had more impact for us. I don't think anyone understood how big the Quake phenomenon was becoming, but I mean, it became the biggest thing in gaming, and we were right there. In that rising tide, all ships rise. So we benefited from that.
Which is really interesting because you couldn't just go into the store and buy Quake and make it run on your Voodoo card, because you would also have to download the mini GL driver and the GL Quake update. So you have to do a lot of stuff to make it run on Voodoo hardware. It was still such a phenomenon. This is really interesting.
I know. I don't remember those particular details, but it wouldn't surprise me. But people were such big fans of Quake that they would do anything to get it. And it was kind of I would say not kind of, it was synergistic because we enabled Quake to run in a spectacular way. And Quake enabled us to show off our graphics board. It was all relatively inexpensive. And so it was just an amazing and wonderful synergistic effect between those two.
Yes.
Hardware enabling software and software showcasing hardware. It's a great thing. It's a rare thing.
Yeah, but it happened again with Unreal in 98, which was a few years later, of course. But the Unreal-based games always ran best on Voodoo hardware. Up until Unreal Tournament was also fastest on Voodoo 5, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So this was another big push for your hardware.
Yes. And remember, from the first days, we knew that it was all about the game, that you had to be. And that ultimately became a reason why I left the company.
Would you elaborate on that?
So the company had gone public. We had hired a new CEO, and he took the company in a very different direction. We had created this great ecosystem, if you will, of game developers, game players, all who loved our platform. And they wanted to make the company into more of just like a conventional graphics board, graphics chip company. And my argument was, we're going to lose all of our value. People will spend good money to buy a game accelerator. They won't spend $1 to run Microsoft Word. It comes with every PC, and you're going to take this race car and put it down into a Honda Civic. It doesn't make any sense. That whole pitch, why I was against doing this, and that resulted in the purchase of STB and this whole nightmare. I suggested, this is really early days for this. I said that we should have our own brand of PCs.
Oh, interesting.
And if we had a Voodoo PC, this is long before Voodoo, but if we had a Voodoo PC, what I argued was people would basically buy our PC because we'd bundle, games with it and stuff like that. And in effect, and they'd buy a new GPU every 2 years. So we have this annuity business that looks very much like Nintendo or PlayStation. Let's focus on that business. That's where we win. And I lost that battle. Instead of building a branded PC and becoming really more of a game platform company, they became a graphics chip board company. And that's why I went into the professional side of things, is because I could stay focused on high performance graphics.
Yeah, I think you tried to become or to establish Voodoo and Glide as a kind of a hardware agnostic platform, because the Voodoo cards were integrated into PCs and arcades and the Mac. And you were trying to get into the consoles as well with the Sega deal, which then fell through, but you tried. So you were almost everywhere. Not in mobile gaming, but that wasn't a thing in the 90s, of course. But
right. Well, we had good presence, but of course, the quest is always, how do you grow the business, both from revenue and margins? If you look at a gaming PC at the time, we may retire $250 to $500 of revenue from that based on whatever board they happen to use. And of course, if it was through a third party, like a Diamond or whatever, we would extract the revenue of the chip. So if a Voodoo 3 or whatever GPU was $100, then our total revenue from a gaming PC is about 5% of the value of the PC. The reason why I'd propose building a game PC is that even at like a 30% gross margin, we would be able to retire significantly more revenue and margins to the company with the promise of selling games to that same audience and selling GPU upgrade products over time. The thing I had proposed was taking the business still focused on games, but moving up the food chain a little bit and seeing if we could retire some more revenue. That would have queered some PC guys, but we had a good way to do this. And this was part of my proposal. And ultimately, Nvidia adopted what I'm about to suggest, which was we have a line of professional GPUs that we sell or for our PC platforms. And then we have commodity products that we sell through third parties. And Voodoo Graphics was uniquely constructed this way because you could sell single silicon to the consumer market, and then we would sell, the SLI silicon into our base platform. So there was a natural way to divide the commodity business alive and focus on a higher margin product. And, they didn't want to do it. So I left.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
So were you for or against the Voodoo Rush when you started developing it?
I have to take some blame for that. It was a bad idea.
I think the idea itself wasn't that bad. It didn't work out.
We were desperate to have a Windows accelerator.
Yeah.
And we did not have that skill set. Hell, we didn't even have the skill set to do a VGA. We had to license one. Then we hired a guy to do it, but we were only 3D. The whole architecture. In fact, one of the reasons why the product was successful was because it was so simple, we could make it really fast. So, the fact that we had I don't know if you remember this, but we have a pass-through, a relay on the board originally, and it would click over.
Yeah.
And everyone said, you're never going to sell that. Never, ever. I mean, I remember meeting with the CEO of Diamond Multimedia, and we're showing this to him, and he goes, no one's ever going to buy that. And I think Gary might have said, well, we think otherwise. This guy wasn't a gamer. And it's like, he was wrong. He was dead wrong.
Yes, but the Diamond cards, they didn't click because they didn't use the mechanical relays anymore. Only the very first, the Orchid Righteous 3D made this famous click, and it's really famous among 3dfx fans.
Yeah,
this one card, only the very first silicon of that particular card that does the click, and you can find the click as a WAV file online, and you can find it on YouTube, and people are sharing it. It's not spectacular; it's just a little click, but it's great. As I said, the Diamond Monster did not click, but it was still a great card.
I don't even remember that. I mean, I think I have a monster somewhere around here. That was another aspect of kind of being a small, agile company, was trying to be a guerrilla fighter, right? And so if you're a guerrilla fighter, from the movie Enemy of the State, you're small, they're big, you're agile, they're clumsy. And so we started making our weaknesses into features, so that making the click a thing, that kind of happened on its own. When that click happens, it's game time.
Yes. Same with the 3dfx logo that then appears.
Yeah. That was my goofy idea, was the power screen. But the click, making that into a thing was a lot of fun. Because we couldn't do things, like because we weren't a Windows accelerator, because we didn't have a VGA, it did let us really focus on the features that were important to game developers. And my argument was adding that silicon might give you some higher volumes, but that silicon that's taking away from game value and adds no real value. And we avoided that for as long as we could.
But didn't you, or some of you at least, work on a 2D Windows accelerator for Pellucid or for Media Vision later? When
we did, but that was a whole chip. And so we didn't want to expend that silicon. I mean, that was Scott was the architect of that thing. It was a True Color 1024, I think we called it. And we could have replicated that, but that would be at the expense of a lot of 3D features. And we just, didn't make any sense. And that's kind of the genesis of the Voodoo Rush, where we started this conversation, that easy way to get to market with a combined 2D, 3D product. So we partnered with a couple of different companies trying to make that work. And it did ultimately work. But because we were sharing the frame buffer with the 2D chip, the performance wasn't as good as a pure 3D graphics performer. And because the guys we were partnered up with were not like the best in the world, they weren't like Matrox, with a screaming.
It was Alliance. Yeah.
Yeah. We had one other guy too.
Yeah.
What you got was mediocre 3dfx performance and mediocre 2D Windows performance. And so we had this mediocre chip, and it was overpriced and underperformer. So it was I take full blame for that. I mean, the engineering team did a great job, and we tried to market it, but it was a half measure, and one should not do half measures.
So the OEMs didn't like it. I guess it was intended for the OEM market, right?
It was, but it was late, which always hurts with the product, and it didn't perform as well. So it was kind of in this dead zone between gamers who would rather have a real Voodoo card and people that were like doing professional stuff and rather have a real 2D S3 or whatever card. And we were just caught in between. So, just didn't work. And that happens.
But after that, you had a great success with Voodoo 2 and Banshee, of course, which was kind of
fully integrated.
It was kind of a bit slower than Voodoo 2, but still considered to be Rush done right. But there is really conflicting information online about the success of Voodoo 2, because everyone says Voodoo 2 was a big success. But then there was a press release from 3dfx where you're saying Voodoo 2 sales are below expectations. This is really interesting. So was Voodoo 2 a success, or was it below expectations?
Success. I mean, it was the success. It was the springboard that everything else came from. I mean, Voodoo 1 was a good success as well, but Voodoo 2 was crazy. I mean, Voodoo 2, everything exploded. If it was a quarterly release, sales could be up or down.
Yeah, maybe this was just a seasonal problem, but you're saying that overall Voodoo 2 was a big success.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember having allocation meetings trying to decide who's going to get chips. Mm-hmm. That's always it's a good and bad problem in the silicon business.
Then after you left, 3dfx made this fateful decision to buy STB. Yeah. Before you left, did you ever discuss a move like this, entering the board market?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I had pitched this idea of us going into the PC business, and intrinsically being a board maker for the high-end boards, but not trying to compete with Diamond and Creative and Orchid, letting those companies continue selling boards, because we had such scalability in the product. You could have, we built, subsystems with 8 GPUs on them.
Yeah.
And so keeping the 2 or 4 GPU versions for our own use and still permitting the volume resellers to sell, things based on our chips, I thought was a better business model. Competing with a channel you've taken years to create, which is what the STB acquisition did. So you drive away your channel partners, and you also, alienate people that have a particular favorite. If people like Diamond products, they want to buy another Diamond product. And very few companies have shown the kind of market power it takes to do that. So Apple did it, right? They had opened up, and then Jobs came back and they closed it back up, and they've succeeded quite well because of that. But they are also executing quite well as a company. In the silicon business, which is what we became, ultimately is just basically a graphics chip company. you're only as good as your last product. And you have to have a new product every year, and it's got to be in your customers' hands before Thanksgiving for them to make Christmas. And so 3dfx missed 2 of those cycles. The STB thing changed their dynamic, but I think ultimately was the ruination of the company. They became just another graphics board company, and that's a tough business.
Yeah, because they alienated all the other 3D board makers,
Exactly.
and they all joined Nvidia. And I also heard rumors that STB's factory in Mexico couldn't compete with the fabs in Asia.
That was my understanding as well.
Yeah.
To be perfectly candid, I was off the board by then.
Mm-hmm.
I only had, insight as a shareholder primarily, and of course all my friends that were there. But the STB acquisition was not well considered, didn't have sufficient due diligence. Some of us voted against it, but it still passed because, the predominant amount of shares were out. I didn't have any control then. I think it changed the whole nature of the company and ultimately killed it.
Do you think it wouldn't have died otherwise, even though they missed the production cycles?
It's hard to say. I mean, the next chip was a spectacular product, and it was going to come out. It was going to be a very sweet product. We'd already sold a bunch of it. I mean, we were ready to roll. It's hard to say because Nvidia was reaching its stride at the same time. And of course, ATI had good products as well, Radeon.
Yeah.
So they were kind of adding better and better 3D to their capabilities. Ultimately, they all kind of become the same. If you look at a high-end Radeon versus a high-end GeForce, they're pretty close.
Yes.
But we had the love from people that no one else had. And it's intangible, but it's quite significant. And so I think there's a good chance it would have survived without doing that, but that certainly accelerated its demise by an STB.
Going back a year or two just once, there was this Sega deal which didn't come through for some reason, and no one really knows why Sega canceled the deal and went with PowerVR instead of 3dfx. Do you know why? Do you happen to find out ever?
I don't know exactly. So I was very involved in that thing. There was one year I think I made like 17 or 18 trips to Japan. And before I left 3dfx, I said, we really need our person on the ground in Japan to manage this deal because we had no one there. And the problem with that, of course, is that NEC, which at the time was, fabricating the PowerVR product, they play golf with the guys from Sega, right?
Oh, okay.
They go to baseball games with a guy from Sega. They probably take them fishing. It's in a place like Japan, and this is true kind of everywhere. It's very important about relationships. We had a relationship with the key engineer for the Dreamcast and maybe like a buyer, but we didn't have great relationships with all the staff, the product managers, and all. And so I think, and the reason why they settled the case is because NEC and I guess there were some other parties to the suit. They interfered with our contract and took it away from us. So basically, someone from Sega had to decide to do that. I'm not sure who it was. I think the reason is because even though we had the deal, quote unquote, we got outsold by Sega and NEC people on the ground. That was a pretty good deal for us. It was going to be a real moneymaker and really put us on the map. And they should have just hired a couple of really key guys to manage that account and make it happen.
Were they going to use the Voodoo graphics or something new? Were you developing something?
It was a different chip, but it was based on Voodoo graphics.
That would have been really interesting. Might have helped the Dreamcast.
Yeah, it was already in trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, there were so many things that could have happened at 3dfx. Like, we tried to get all of the arcade makers to unify around one platform. It failed spectacularly. That could have extended the life of the arcades, actually, because all these guys spent a huge amount of their budget on hardware for coin-op machines, and they could have just spent that money on games and published on a common platform. We worked with Intel on this. We had a whole initiative. I can't even recall what it was called now, but it was some kind of coin-op LBE thing. It was Intel, Microsoft, and us. And we got some adoption, but it was all by little guys. Couldn't get the big guys to do it. So there's just a lot of inefficiency in the market, and we can't conquer it all.
That's fascinating. I've never heard about that. There was an initiative between 3dfx, Intel, and Microsoft to go into the arcade market. Microsoft and the arcade.
No, to facilitate people that are in the arcade market to use our. And we made a whole line of PCs for that. It was called Graphite. So if you open up a San Francisco Rush or an NFL Blitz or some of those games, you would find a PC built by 3dfx and then Quantum 3D that powered those games. We built a little game controller so you could have all the gadgets on, the guns and all that stuff. Yeah, I even have some patents in that field. It's crazy. Yeah, we tried to enable the arcade companies to unite around a common platform that would be inexpensive and upgradable and all that stuff, and then just focus on games, publish their games for home and for PC. And the Incredible Technologies Golf people, I don't know if you've ever seen that game. It was kind of a classic network golf game. They kind of bought into the whole thing, and some kind of smaller companies, but we could never get Capcom or any of the big guys to sign up for it. They don't trust Microsoft.
Ah, I see. Looking back, what would you say is the enduring impact of the Voodoo brand? What was changed in the PC gaming market or in the gaming market overall by Voodoo graphics and everything that came afterwards?
I guess I have two answers for that. One is kind of some advice I give to other startups, which is if you have a new technology, like Voodoo Graphics was arguably the first perspective correct texture mapping graphics chip that had sufficient fill rate performance and triangle performance to accommodate fairly complex games with real-time performance on a budget. You could do this on a reality engine. You just couldn't do it on a PC. And so the obvious candidates for those were things like driving simulators, fighting games, but it started to open up a whole number of other applications that this technology enabled, ultimately leading to where Nvidia is today. The path of that, having a really interesting little technology that enables a bunch of new applications that in turn drives the technology, that synergistic effect between application developers and silicon in the whole ecosystem was really fascinating to watch how we went from a company with a handful of games to literally thousands of applications that required decent 3D acceleration. And now today, millions of applications.
Yeah.
Even things that don't really need it, people use it. To me, that's the most interesting revelation that came out of that whole adventure. Because without 3dfx, you don't have Nvidia. Their trajectory would be very different than what it was today. So having two companies really driving each other the way we did was really good for the market. On a more tangible note, having good 3D graphics enabled, which is really a high art form now, is really bringing 3D rendering into the masses. Because if you had to wait for it to be rendered, people just aren't that patient. And so having some higher performance 3D rendering is a big game changer for all kinds of game genres, not just, first person shooters or sims, but everything. And it now permeates our life. Everyone expects to see things in 3D, to some degree. So it's been interesting.
Would you say that the Voodoo graphics chip helped make the PC the dominant gaming platform on the planet, surpassing the PlayStation?
I think so. I think we opened people's eyes to 3D gaming on the PC. There were rasterized, renderers, low res like Quake and Doom and things like that. But the visual experience of having really good 3D, especially as we added lighting effects and anti-aliasing and things like that, the further you are from distracting artifacts, the more it's easy to believe what you're seeing on screen. And so these beautifully rendered games today that have such complex graphics, it's a movie. And the realism is so remarkable that everyone gets jaded by it. But Voodoo Graphics was arguably the thing that kind of started that. And where we are today is remarkable. I mean, we couldn't even imagine this level of graphics quality way back when. I remember the first time we did 1 million triangles per second. That was a really big deal. In fact, I lost a bet on that because they gave it to me for one of my talks at like a WinHack or a Windows developer. I can't remember where it was. It was a famous talk, but I can't remember where it was because we were the first people to show 1 million triangles per second. And I think I was on stage with Bill Gates or something like that, but it's a long time ago. So yeah, I think it was instrumental. It's a shame the company didn't survive and go on to do the things that it could have done. But that is one thing where you have to point to the genius of Jensen and his remarkable work ethic and persistence, because compared to the management we had at 3dfx, compared to Jensen, kind of after Gordy and I really checked out, no one could match his desire to win. He is extremely competitive. And, I worked with him later on at Quantum 3. They were very good. They supported us quite well. I currently employ NVIDIA GPUs in my business today and NVIDIA networking cards. But that focus on winning and having a consistent objective and really superb execution is why NVIDIA basically beat out 3dfx.
Okay, now my final question is a two-part question. There are several articles about the early days of 3dfx, and most of them claim that all the founders, which would include you, of course, were PC gamers. But Scott, he told me he wasn't a gamer at all. So what about you?
None of us were gamers.
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, the origin story to 3dfx is around games. I mean, the way it all started, we were at Pellucid. Do you know the origin story of 3dfx? So we were at Pellucid. The Nintendo project with SGI was getting rave reviews, and Sega had their Real 3D based or Lockheed based systems for Daytona and Virtua Fighter, and that was just terrible graphics, but they had them. So we got approached by a U.S. coin-op arcade game company called American Laser Games. And one of their owners came by and said, "Hey, we need a 3D graphics chip, so we can compete in the game business." And I knew nothing about arcade games. So myself and one of the other founders of Pellucid, Herb Kuda, who was also a founder of SGI, we went down to a coin-op show in Anaheim. And that must have been
in 94. I read about that trip.
Either 90, that could be right. And we're walking around the show and we're seeing all this terrible 3D graphics. And the Sega thing that was the first time we had seen it. And everyone's raving over it. It's like, well, this is pathetic. We can do better than this. And so we came back and I started kind of working on some ideas to go about do it. Herb ultimately did not come with us, which was a shame at 3dfx. But other folks from Pellucid, Scott and Gary, and we started talking about it and decided to make a run for it because we knew, based on what we had seen, we could, with a fairly simple graphics architecture focused on texture map games that could leverage, the forthcoming Pentium processor and PCI bus. So those things all came together to give us the elements of something that was more powerful than, it would have been as powerful as a mid-range SGI workstation, which would be fine for this. And especially like up to 800 by 600 resolution. But none of us, we all had played flight simulators and stuff, but no one was an avid gamer. Not Scott, really not Gary, not me. I hadn't been really into games since like college. It'd been a long time. So, But we all became much more astute about them. The last game that I played all the way to the end was probably Unreal.
In 98.
Yeah, something like that. And I was so burnt out on games that I was really happy to be in the professional, with flight simulators and training stuff. That was kind of cool.
Oh, interesting. So that's one myth debunked. And it also would answer my second part of the question, which would be if you're still playing games these days, but since you never really started, I guess you don't.
I play puzzle games. Mm-hmm. I'm one of the last Sudoku players because I still love Sudoku and the symmetry of it.
Completely in 2D.
Yeah. 3D games, not much. I mostly play chess and word games and strategy games. So I don't do a lot of 3D except in my business. And there I'm doing probably more AI projects and 3D projects now. I sell these Nvidia GPUs into the test and measurement market, and they're used for all kinds of things. Everything from spectrum analysis to vision problems to, we have an application in Scotland, and it's a real-time welding inspection capability. It's like for welding, like for automotive or it's for robots and things. It's really cool, and you couldn't do it without a big GPU.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Not much games.
Okay, do you know about Gary? So he wasn't a gamer as well, I guess.
No, Gary did some more stuff because he was a software developer, and he had written some of the OpenGL examples. Mm-hmm. And so they had game-like features. But in terms of playing games, no, I think we kind of just learned about them, right? We got really involved in playing them to understand what was going on. And then we hired some people from the game industry, which is also very helpful.
Yeah, like John Carmack. As an advisor,
as advisor. But we actually hired people who came from like Sony, Nintendo, came from Sega, so people that really understood games. And then we hired someone from Activision to try and get some real expertise in house.
Okay, that's it then. Those are all of my questions. Thank you very much.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you very much. All the best for your hand and
appreciate it.
for your dog. Bye.
Good luck.